Yeah, we got some questions about the NRA and sort of Second Amendment advocacy groups more broadly. This comes from Josiah Hunter. He asks what we think the pro 2A movement is going to look like in a post NRA landscape. So he's assuming that the NRA either folds or emerges from its legal troubles that we've covered pretty extensively, just in a different form or a different strength. And he talks about, what does that look like in a world where they're no longer the top dog? And he asks specifically about things like the lobbying world, gun safety and training, instructor certification, which obviously is something that the NRA does far more than some of the other groups have the means to do currently. So what do you think, Steve? What does that world look like without the NRA being the top dog?
I think that's a really good question that gets wildly overlooked by basically everyone in media, whether it's gun media or political media or news media, what have you. Nobody is really talking about this very much, and it's hugely important because the NRA is far more important to gun politics than people seem to want to believe anymore. Even the gun control groups have kind of moved on to new boogeymen. Like they're talking about the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is the industry's trade group, as they're kind of setting them up for to be the new boogeyman of the gun control movement. And, first off, the NRA isn't gone. It's still the largest and most influential gun rights group in the country, or any kind of gun group. You look at their finances; they're terrible compared to the NRA's previous finances. They're still way beyond anyone else working on the gun issue today. The gun control groups are catching up a bit. If you look at some of their, like the PAC numbers, and we'll have more on this in the near future. But if you look at political spending from their PACs, the NRA's fundraising has fallen off and spending has fallen off significantly over the last several years. And they're being caught by the gun control groups who, now that it takes three significant gun control groups to match, what the NRA is trying to do, Everytown, Giffords, and Brady, but they are getting much closer. I will say, of course, that Everytown, for instance, was supposed to spend $60 million in 2020 and then just didn't do it. And no one even noticed outside, like, really was the only one who covered the fact that they fell wildly short. I think they spent about 25 million of their planned 60 million. And now obviously the pandemic happened. So that's probably part of the reason, but Michael Bloomberg just didn't give them the money that year that he had pledged. So, it's not as though the gun control groups are doing so great on their own, and they are still largely reliant on really big dollar donors like Michael Bloomberg almost exclusively.
Right.
That guy has really funded the vast majority of the modern gun control movement. It hasn't been. It's a very different funding structure than what you see at the NRA, which does rely much more on smaller donors, individual donors, than the gun control side. But either way, point is they're not doing nearly as much as they were, and nobody is making up that gap. There are areas where the other gun rights groups are sort of picking up the slack, almost exclusively in the legal realm, where the NRA hasn't been, a super active group anyway for a long time, even when their finances were much higher. Certainly they're not in it. They're still important. They were their state affiliate is the New York Rifles, or the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, which just won the Brewing case. So,
right.
You can't discount their legal efforts altogether either. But, groups like the Second Amendment Foundation and Firearms Policy Coalition and Gun Owners of America have become much more active. I mean, some of them were around and very active. Second Amendment Foundation has been around for a long time doing legal work. But, that's an area where you're seeing more of the slack being picked up by these gun rights groups, but you're not seeing that nearly as much in the lobbying realm. In DC at the state level, you're seeing some more effort from Gun Owners of America than you have in the past, especially in places like Pennsylvania. They've got more of a ground team together there, but really nobody is matching what the NRA has traditionally done in those areas, and that's a huge problem, I think, going forward, especially if the NRA continues on this trajectory of losing money in membership and maybe even has its losing in court. They just lost another case in the Second Circuit on their First Amendment claims against some New York officials from 2018, and they've had a string of losses. They lost bankruptcy. They've had to settle with their former contractor, Echo McQueen. They've lost efforts to try and move this New York case to different courts. And the whole thing has had a really detrimental impact on the organization. And I mean, honestly, you don't even hear very much about them in DC right now. Maybe that'll change as the election season heats up and they start spending more money in some of these swing races. I mean, that's always been a big part of that they've played that no one else is, as far as I can tell, as far as we've seen, right? Jake has really tried to take up that mantle. And so it's a pretty big deal for the NRA to be weakened because the NRA does a lot of stuff. I mean, safety and training is another great example of, they're still doing it. It's not like they don't exist anymore, but they're smaller than they were. They have less resources to commit to that. They're spending the biggest line item in their budget has been on administrative legal expenses, which is effectively paying their outside lawyer and others to fight their dissolution case in New York, this corruption case that they're under. Now there is a bright spot in that case, and just in the fact that Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, requested full dissolution of the NRA, right, to completely disband it as a potential punishment for the allegations of corruption over there. But that was taken off the table by the judge, so they won't be disbanded. So they will exist. They'll continue to exist after this case, so long as their finances stay sustainable, which is honestly a legitimate question. I mean, for instance, their membership has been shrinking since 2018, according to internal documents that we published earlier this year. We don't hear anything about their membership from them anymore, which is a bad sign, right? If they were gaining a lot of members, which frankly you would think that they would be at this is a political environment where they should be gaining members, right? You had 2 straight years of record gun sales, millions of new gun owners, and a president who is hostile towards gun rights, is pushing for all sorts of new gun control legislation. You just had the first federal gun restrictions passed in decades. All of these that you have a candidate running in Texas who's openly for confiscation of firearms. You would think that all of these things would combine to generate more memberships for the NRA. Like and we're in an election year, right? But the NRA has made no announcements about putting any numbers on their, whether they've got new members. And even if they're still using the 5 million number, which we know from the internal documents has not been accurate for a while, they first hit 5 million back in 2012. I mean, is it 2012 or 2013? So either way, it's like about a decade ago. And they should be, just by population growth alone, significantly higher than that. So there's a lot of problems. They may get reformed effectively through this court case, because what's left on the table is removing basically NRA leadership, Wayne LaPierre, other members of the executive committee, and that could result in a brand new NRA. Now, I think people are rightfully skeptical that Letitia James is going to, given that she would be the one advocating for this, is that it's going to end up as a positive thing for the organization, even if she gets to that point. I mean, a lot of people, of course, Wayne LaPierre has a lot of critics in the gun rights movement. A lot of people want to see him removed from leadership at the NRA, but the same people probably don't trust Letitia James very much. And so really, if you're somebody who wants to see the NRA's leadership removed and replaced, you think they're doing a poor job based on, the financial performance, the legal performance, all this stuff that's happened, the shrinking of the membership. Your best hope is probably the judge in that New York case. Just hope that he's actually worried about the interests of the members over anyone else. So, it is a significant problem, and it's one that's not talked about much. The waning influence of the NRA is a big deal. They are the main player in the political realm. There's nobody else that comes anywhere close to having their level of influence on Capitol Hill, on gun issues, or really in a lot of state houses too. There's a lot of great state-based groups. Of course, a lot of them are NRA affiliates, and there are plenty that aren't NRA affiliates that are also very influential in the state houses. But it's not as though you've seen a big push from anyone to try and replace the NRA's a number of the things they do. Really, the legal realm, you've seen a lot of the gun rights groups have gone there. That's sort of the current fad is getting, filing your own lawsuits, which not a bad idea at this point in time, right? There's a lot of fertile ground for winning those cases right now. So it makes sense, and you don't need as much organization or money to get involved in that as you would to build a nationwide gun rights network that's actually influential across the country and on Capitol Hill. Those are much harder things to do and take a lot longer